Hello, 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 hello. I think we're going to get started. If you want to grab a seat, a glass of seltzer or wine. Um, Welcome, everyone. Welcome to the Poetry Project. My name is Mira Asaños. I am the program director here, and it is so nice to be back after a long winter break. This is our first event of the season. Yes. Woo! And we are beginning or launching the season with the launch precisely of this beautiful little object called the device. You can find the device over there at the table. It's for sale for $10. It is a new magazine, and I will say more about the device in a few minutes. But before I launch into more details, I wanted to say a few words about the season. It is a great season. I invite you to come back to our events. They're really, I think, wonderful events. And it's a season, at least for me, that takes a political turn. There are a lot of the writers and poets that we've invited have like explicitly sort of leftist positions, and we want to kind of encourage that kind of discourse and think about culture as a site of struggle. Particularly in the current conjuncture, because I think that is what is needed. Come back also next week. We have 2 readings. Milestone Johnson, who is our ESB fellow, will be reading with Noah Michaela Fields. Yes, on Wednesday, we have the wonderful Dawn Yordi, who is here in the audience somewhere. Where are you? Over there, exactly. And yes, and Mel Elberg will be reading with Dawn. Two beloved members of the Poetry Project community, so please come back for that. We also launched our spring workshops. I know people were eager to take in-person workshops, so we're offering 2 in-person workshops, one with Michael Cavuto called Poetry and Magic. I think we still have a few spots left, and one with Kay Gabriel on derivative writing. We also have a deep study coming up in person with Nora Treatbaby 2 weeks from now, and we still also have spots left. The title of the deep study is Broke, Tight, and Stressed, Poetics of Financial Peril and Affordability Poetics. So I strongly recommend this deep study with Nora. Okay, back to the device. So in the fall, the Poetry Project is turning 60. I know we don't look like it, but we are getting there, 60s this fall. And the device is a new magazine that explores the Poetry Project's archives, highlighting moments that can teach us something about what happened here and why, and about the social relationships that have shaped the Poetry Project and its constituencies over the years. We're looking to our past in order to help outline a vision for the future. This new magazine positions itself within a long lineage of Poetry Project publications, and there has been many. Publications that were themselves devices, setting in motion a range of aesthetic trends and conversations. The archive and the kinds of narratives we want to draw out from it is also a site of struggle. So this first issue looks at internationalist organizing at the Poetry Project by highlighting 3 specific events. An evening organized by Patricia Spears Jones in 1984. Patricia will tell us more about this evening, titled Art Against Apartheid. A solidarity movement of US poets in support of the Sandinista Revolution, organized among others by Bob Holman. We'll also hear from Bob about this event. And an anti-Iraq war event organized by Ammiel Alcalay and Anne Waldman, titled Poetry is News. Ammiel sadly couldn't make it tonight, but I will read a short excerpt from the interview. So I want to thank Patricia, Bob, and Ammiel for their generous contributions, and I also want to thank Maru Pabón and Lois Elaine Griffith for responding to the issue. So in order to expand the conversation, we invited writers and poets to respond to the material. And the prompt was very open. We just asked them to write something, whatever sort of they felt inclined to share or whatever they felt moved by, and to respond to the issue with a short text. So we will hear also from Lois and Maru. And last but not least, I wanted to thank and bring into the room Kay Gabriel, who is a driving force behind this issue and also couldn't make it tonight. But Kay worked really hard on this issue and wrote a beautiful introduction. And our dear Heather Glynis will read Kay's introduction for us tonight. So please join me in welcoming Heather to the stage.
Yesterday, here we go. This never works for my height. Yesterday, Kay texted me and asked me if I could read the intro, and she said, "Do your best, quick Gabriel drag." So for a moment, I was gonna get like a black bob, and we're all black. So for the purposes of this, just imagine this is a real Versace dress and it's black. Try and do her voice justice. All transsexuals look alike, as we know, so this won't be a hard reach of the imagination. Fall 2026 will mark 60 years of the Poetry Project. 60 years of providing a home for experimental poetry and radical consciousness in downtown Manhattan. Think of 60 years of readings, performances, workshops, publications, recordings, conversations, benefits, leases, bank statements, insurance agreements, voicemail, and endless correspondence, and you'll find yourself imagining our archive. The dizzying mass of documents that could tell people what was happening here and why people did what they did. Provided, of course, that somebody's there to make sense of it. Without people who make a point of circulating information, making connections, putting documents into relationship with each other, providing context and making arguments, an archive is just that mass of documents, information waiting to happen. People have to get in there and read and listen and interpret in order for it to be useful for us. We're looking towards the project's 60th birthday. Whew. In a moment where a lot of new audiences are finding meaning through our events and publications. There's an urgency to make sense of our history and the meaning that the project holds for people now. When we signed the PAC B, when we signed onto PAC B, the Palestinian campaign for the academic and cultural boycott of Israel, shortly after the start of Israel's genocide in Gaza, we held a Poets for Palestine event here at St. Mark's. The line to get in wrapped the block, like it does for the marathon. People from all over New York, artists, writers, neighborhood people, and international visitors, people across every possible generation, organizers and activists, cram themselves into the church to make something out of each other. And the words and performances here. So, what does this place do for people over time? How does the project enable certain ways of seeing? Why and how does it bring people into particular kinds of meaningful relationship to each other? The device is a new publication for the project, collectively edited by my colleagues and me, Kay Gabriel, meant to highlight different elements of our history. We're digging into that mess of documents and experiences to illuminate what we're doing now and what we might do in the future. The aim is to stimulate our collective sense of a history that matters to us. Think of it as a mnemonic device, providing information and interpretation, breathing life into the past to get us to understand ourselves better and to take stock of our current political, social, and artistic decisions in light of what the project's history makes possible. The first issue thinks about the Poetry Project as a left cultural institution, as a place that makes particular coalitions and particular forms of solidarity possible, linking culture workers into fights for justice and equality. To us, the current staff at the project, it's not surprising that we've been so quick to embrace BDS and PAC B in this nightmarish juncture of history. That's partly because the project got its start as, in a sense, an anti-war cultural institution. Though until now, nobody that I know who's worked here has put a name to that fact. In his authoritative All Poets Welcome, Daniel Kane records that organizing to stop the Vietnam War provided the context within which poets in search of a permanent home for their readings developed their trust and support for Michael Allen, the left-wing rector of St. Mark's at the time. That's to say, people who dedicated themselves in part to poetry deepened their relationships to each other and to the person who would eventually offer them this space at the church through their commitment to stopping a war taking place halfway across the globe. That sense of responsibility in internationalism in practice sowed the seed that became the Poetry Project. And in the early years of programming at the project, there's evidence that people used this place to support that fight. In fall 1968, while Ann Waldman was director, the project held a benefit for the Catonsville Nine, Catholic anti-Vietnam War activists who publicly burned their draft cards. In May 1969, it held a different benefit for the Berkeley Defense Fund, which was fundraising for the legal prosecutions that the state of California was carrying out against anti-war organizers. This issue of the device takes its starting point from thinking about that internationalist spirit at the project. How has this place enabled people who might not otherwise have been active in a particular struggle, to take action and make decisions together to stop bloodshed and enable liberation in places very far away from our home in New York? A glance through the project's history shows repeated flashpoints where people drew on their sense of responsibility to organize each other as conditions changed and sharpened. Across 3 interviews, we focused with Patricia Spears Jones on the fight against apartheid in South Africa, with Bob Holman on solidarity with Nicaragua and against US intervention in Latin America, and with Ammiel Alcalay on solidarity with Palestine and organizing against the US invasion in Iraq. Thinking about the transformations, the durability, and the persistence of this radical liberation-oriented consciousness over time brings to mind Ruth Wilson Gilmore's investigation into what she, riffing on Raymond Williams, calls the infrastructure of feeling. This is Ruthie Gilmore. In the material world, infrastructure underlies productivity. It speeds some processes and slows down others, setting agendas, producing isolation, enabling cooperation. The infrastructure of feeling is material too, in the sense that ideology becomes material, as do the actions that feelings enable or constrain. The infrastructure of feeling is then consciousness foundation, sturdy but not static, that underlies our capacity to select, to recognize viscerally, no less than prudently, imminent possibility, it's like imminence of spirit, not like imminently, imminent possibility as we select and reselect liberatory lineages in a lifetime, as well as between and across generations. This is K. If this first shared investigation into the project's history has a thesis, then it's that the project is part of an infrastructure of feeling that enables a sturdy but not static consciousness over time, and in turn makes it possible for culture workers to be effective in ways they couldn't otherwise have been. Explore that thesis with us in the pages that follow. The device. Okay, Gabriel, everyone.
Thank you so much, Heather, for that beautiful delivery of Kay's text. I will now invite our guests to the stage. All of you together, why not? We will reorganize things up here.
I know. Diva came down. It's good.
Put it behind you too, like
Okay.
it stands up by itself.
Sometimes.
Yes, it does. I put it.
Patricia, we are eager to hear about your interview with Kate. If you can tell us more about it, or if you want to read a few excerpts. The what?
Hello. I feel like I would have to sing. And I can't sing. I mean, I can, but you don't want to hear it. Okay. Also, hello, hello, hello. This sounds funny.
It has echo.
Yeah, that's a big echo. Like I'm at the bottom of whatever ocean. The blizzard ocean. Well, I kind of feel bad because I didn't bring any show and tell stuff. Bob brought all kinds of stuff. I'm still mad. And he has pictures and everything. Oh, wow. This is like that moment in Woodstock.
We don't have to stand to read. Okay.
Hello. Okay. All right. So I was the program coordinator in the 1980s here. I was the first Black person to have an artistic position at the Poetry Project, which brought a lot of issues with it. But one of the better things about it was that I could really help to shift some of the energy towards the Art Against Apartheid movement. There was a lot of organizing around anti-apartheid organizing in the early 80s throughout New York City. Quincy Troop, the Hugh Masekela, Barbara Masekela, June Jordan, all kinds of people were really on top of that, and I just thought there's no way that the Poetry Project could not be involved in this. It was just too big, so I'm going to actually read the letter that was sent to the participants who are going to read at this, and it was pretty amazing. Bob was there. And it was pretty amazing.
This is 1980 when?
4.
84.
Yeah. All right. So September 24th, 1984. And I typed this out on an actual typewriter. Okay. The following poets and performers have agreed to read at an event for Art Against Apartheid. And this is a laundry list of great people, some of whom are still with us, some of whom have passed on. Akua Leslie Hope, Arthur Flowers, Maurice Kinney, no longer with us, Bob Holman, Wesley Brown, Lois Elaine Griffith, Mark Nasdor, Tim Douglas, no longer with us, Lenora Champagne, Barbara Bark, no longer with us, Dale Worsley, Dawood Phillips, Dorothy Allison, Bob Rosenthal, Rochelle Kraut, Norman McAfee, Michael Skolnick, no longer with us, Eileen Miles, and Uma. This is where my glasses don't work very well. Nalumba, a South African poet and performer. And then it talks about when the reading is going to take place at the Parish Hall. There will be a $2 donation.
Wow.
to defray cost. $2. We cannot use grant money for this event.
Right.
We hope to have representatives from organizations dedicated to the struggle against apartheid at the reading, posters, etc. We want this to be a celebration of those who work against what a New York Times editorial writer called the, quote, the evil empire, unquote, of Pretoria, and a dedication to the continued struggle against the racism right here in the USA. I think I wrote that. All right. Please limit your work to 5 minutes. Ha 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 ha. Or less, yeah. There, yeah. There will be a brief introduction of each poet, so please send us one of your blah, blah. Tim Douglas and I are working on a poster for the event, and I wish I had a copy. I should have brought I still have my copy of that poster, and it is pretty amazing. And I was grateful to work with Tim Douglas. If you don't know who Tim Douglas is, Tim was an amazing poet and activist, and unfortunately was one of the victims of HIV. But before he left this world, he did a lot of really great and wonderful things, and it was a joy to work with him here at the project. And we'll probably be in alphabetical order, yeah. Eileen Miles, the Poetry Project Director, and I look forward to seeing you and reading with you on Sunday, October 21st. And people showed up because it was serious. And long before any of the Columbia students were doing anything around this, all kinds of people had already been organizing. Everybody needs to understand that. And when I was talking to Kay, he said, she said, you talked about people in movements thinking about how they could use the people they knew and use media and power to make decision makers all the way up to the federal government make different decisions, back off their support for apartheid, because Ronald Reagan was not going to do that. Ronald Reagan is a stone racist, and he was not going to do that, right? How were you thinking of the role of the project? Quote, for me, a lot of people were doing work, and we realized we needed to be part of that work. How in the hell are you going to support a place that does not support that work? I am not certain of that kind of strategic thinking, but what I did see was people thinking like that, and every once in a while, peer pressure is a good thing, and it needs to be exerted. And then I also had a list of people who were doing movement work. Jane Cortez, Mel Edwards, Quincy Troop, and I talked about David Grundy's book about the Umbra movement, where they talk about going to the UN in support of Lumumba and the African liberation movements. All of this is in New York City. You would never know it. Steve Cannon was teaching at Medgar Evers College, which serves a primarily Afro-Caribbean community. Faye Chang in Chinatown was offering space at the Basement Workshop to writers like Jessica Hagedorn and Tulani Davis. The Artist Call, we'll talk about that more, was raising money. All of this was going on, all at the same time. And it's just another way of saying that there is a way in which all of these movements bleed into each other. And poets are always in the matrix of it, always. Okay, that's it.
Alrighty. So there's going to be a film, part of a film shown here in a few minutes. The film is called Azul, and it's named for the first book by Ruben Dario. Dario was one of the founders of Modernismo. He took the, I'm not going to be able to do this. He took the,
Help him.
he took the Nicaraguense ethos, the whole Central American ethos, to Europe, and that's where, of course, everything got named. However, it's what brought Central American culture, Nicaraguan culture particularly, to Europe, and vice versa. He brought back his connection with Romantics, and even Pere Ubu and Jarry, and even into the symbolists. He brought back to Nicaragua with him. So.
Sorry for the show, y'all.
No, that's we like this. Pedro's going to push the button for the movie too, so he's got a big job ahead of him. It was the 1980s, and Nicaragua was in the crosshairs. The Sandinistas, named after Augusto Sandino, were revolting against the Somoza United States empire that was called the Contras. Actually, they weren't against it; they were for it. So that's the way everything was upside down. Sandino had fought against the Somoza government back in the 30s, and managed to entice the U.S. Marines into fighting him. He was, after 7 years of battles in which it looked like it was a revolution. It was a revolution for Nicaraguan independence that eventually got squashed, and he was jailed and assassinated. But he became the hero and the driving force of the Sandinistas. 9 members of the ruling Sandinista party, 7 had published books of poetry. Mm-hmm. Ernesto Cardenal was the Minister of Culture. And Cardenal, you know from his liberation theology, a Jesuit priest who believed in the poor in the way that Jesus did, and so therefore was an outcast until the Sandinistas came into power. It was a utopian government. In literacy moved from under 30% to over 70% in 5 years. And Cardenal started 120 different poetry workshops. Imagine a minister of culture starting poetry workshops throughout the country. These poetry workshops were both to write poetry and also for purposes of literacy. Mm-hmm. Cardenal visited the U.S. The manifesto that he and Ginsberg wrote was published in the Poetry Project newsletter, and in it was Cardenal's mailing address for anybody who wanted to come down to Nicaragua. This was how local the newsletter was at this point, when there were 100 or so poets who could be called, at that point, I was part of what might have been called the third generation New York school, although at this point, the third generation is gone, but the second generation is still. We remember them, but the third generation dissipated, as did the Mimeo machine, which is just a big story of where that Mimeo machine ended up. But we'll not go into that. We'll not go into that tonight.
Yes, no doubt.
Okay, so the poet I know who answered the call to write to Cardenal was Roland Legiardi Laura. Roland went down there, was completely turned on by what was happening with the Sandinistas, and decided that it wasn't enough to write his poems about it. He had to make a movie. His movie, Azul, is a poem, is comprised of poems that rattle through history and create a poem of poems. So maybe this is a good time to watch it. Pedro, what do you think? We're going to need lights and popcorn, Nicole, and it's going to be above your head, Lois.
Oh, okay.
So here it is. Roland would become one of the people like me who helped reopen the New Eurekan Poets Cafe in
All
the
these
late 80s.
3 or
Here we
4
go.
last poets. Manolo Cuadra, Ricardo Morales, Fernando Gordillo, and Rugama. All these poets had left us a real good heritage of fighting, battling poetry, strong writing, writing that was never separated from their living and their imagination and their dreaming.
La Tierra es un satélite de la Luna. El Apolo 2 costó más que el Apolo 1. El Apolo 1 costó bastante. El Apolo 3 costó más que el Apolo 2. El Apolo 2 costó más que el Apolo 1. El Apolo 1 costó bastante. El Apolo 4 costó más que el Apolo 3. El Apolo 3 costó más que el Apolo 2. El Apolo 2 costó más que el Apolo 1. El Apolo 1 costó bastante. El Apolo 8 costó un montón, pero no se sintió porque los astronautas eran protestantes y desde la Luna leyeron la Biblia, maravillando y alegrando a todos los cristianos, y a la venida el Papa Paulo VI les dio la bendición. El Apolo 9 costó más que todos juntos con el Apolo 1, que costó bastante. Los bisabuelos de la gente de Acahualinca tenían menos hambre que los abuelos. Los bisabuelos se murieron de hambre. Los abuelos de la gente de Acahualinca tenían menos hambre que los padres. Los abuelos murieron de hambre. Los padres de la gente de Acahualinca tenían menos hambre que los hijos de la gente de allí. Los padres se murieron de hambre. La gente de Acahualinca tiene menos hambre que los hijos de la gente de allí. Los hijos de la gente de Acahualinca no nacen por hambre y tienen hambre de nacer para morirse de hambre. Bienaventurados los pobres, porque de ellos será la luna.
¿Quién ha visto una lira? La lira es una palabra. Era instrumento, pero ahora es más, es un vocablo. Las cosas que se vuelven palabras se magnifican o rebajan. El lenguaje tiene la virtud del amor, exalta o mengua. Por eso la lira me inquieta. La lira es cosa muy barata. ¿Quién no tiene lira? Yo quiero algo diferente. Algo hecho de este alambre de púas, algo que no pueda tocar un cualquiera, que haga sangrar los dedos, que dé un son como el son que hacen las balas, cuando inspirado el enemigo quiere romper nuestro alambrado a fuerza de tiros.
Y mientras deslizas entre el viento palabras compañeras, una sensata idea rejuega en mi cerebro. Crepúsculos de aromas que caen al vacío, el dolor de un mañana, perplejo y agitado, y el futuro dolor de los años futuros que puedan mudar quejas en mi ego. La luna se trasnocha, cuela el aire helado, hamaca y desconsuelo, palabras y humareda. Eso es todo el poema, bien corto, pues, ¿ya? Pero lleva la característica del versolibrismo, así, de la corriente que dicen ustedes, pues, no sé si le dieron algún sentido, pues es escueto.
No, sí, tiene sentido, pero siempre es un sentido como si te encontrás en un fondo o algo ya, donde solo una oscuridad tremenda te... O sea, no, en parte no miras algo futuro también, de expresar algo futuro, algo que vos querrás ver.
Yo lo que
en el
pienso
mañana.
acerca de este poema de ahorita es que más bien él tomó el carácter individualista de cada persona, pues, de cada combatiente, porque realmente al amanecer y todo, vos pensás, pues, ala, otro día vergueado, pues, me voy a sudar en puta, voy a seguirme cachimbeando, pues, más o menos bajo ese aspecto lo agarraste, ¿verdad? O sea, ves el futuro como algo duro, pues, porque es duro para nosotros, son años de que son guerras, pues, y son plomos, no caramelos los que nos van a volar, pues. Y vamos a ver si aún terminando nosotros nuestro cumplimiento, pues, sobre la ley, sobre nuestro deber, todavía no sabemos si va a crear algún fruto, pues, en adelante, si la guerra va a continuar o si no va a continuar, si nuestro trabajo todavía va a seguir o si no va a seguir, pues, se va a quedar estancado. Es muy bonito, sí, ese poema, sobre todo cómo lo agarras las rimas y las palabras que ocupás.
Cuando hablo de la poesía y cuando estoy diciendo que es parte de mi necesidad personal, no la puedo desligar de lo que he ido viviendo en cada momento. Entonces mi infancia, como la mayoría de los nicaragüenses, y me atrevería a decir de latinoamericanos, una formación cristiana, en mi época era una concepción que yo llego a calificarla en ese momento de una concepción mágica de la fe, fascinante, sí. Cuando yo era niña me encantaba el ambiente de la iglesia, a la que me indujeron 3 tías abuelas, que eran muy rezadoras, lo que nosotros llamamos beatas en los pueblos. Y mi familia estaba ubicada en ese momento dentro del gobierno de Somoza. Mi padre fue un militar, miembro de la Guardia Nacional de Somoza. Entonces, eso me condicionó por mucho tiempo. Mientras compañeros míos iban dando respuestas de compromiso a la realidad social, yo de corazón estaba con ellos y realmente sabía que tenían razón, pero emocionalmente no estaba preparada para la ruptura. Y pienso que todo ese proceso se va reflejando en mi poesía. Entonces hay una época un poco evasiva de mi vida, de escepticismo, una cierta dosis de escepticismo con la base de temor íntima que tenía. Y también pienso que esa poesía expresa mi propio desarrollo interno. Y también ahí hay poemas dolorosos de la ruptura, con mi padre, con mis hijos. Se definen muchas cosas, pues, a través de la ruptura. Fugaces, intermitentes, las luces de los automóviles me deslumbran a través de la ventanilla del pequeño bus que nos transporta de la oficina. Recorremos Managua de noche, unas veces atravesando silenciosos barrios residenciales y otras bordeando el mercado oriental que semeja un campamento gitano con sus lonas y su fuego bajo el sereno. A esta hora recuerdo cómo se le humedecen los ojos a mi madre cuando lee mi poema. A esta hora, madre, yo también, ansiosa de estrechar a mis hijos, retorno al hogar.
Laura. So I just would like to complete this section with We traveled all over. We went to the coffee plantations. We went to villages where crafts were being made. We read in front of 500 soldiers. Diane Burns, Pedro Pietri, Joy Harjo, Carolyn Forche, Alarista, Kevin Garion. Where is this thing I wanted to read you? Here it is. I remember a mural in Managua. Dario wore his bowler hat. Sandino wore a big 10-gallon hat, and the artist had drawn the duo with the line from the bowler going into the 10-gallon, so the two hats and figures were merged. The artist united the two iconic appearances, the one fighting with bullets, the other fighting with words, with culture. And now a quote from Roland. My fear is that this film might become a document, a historical record of a culture that no longer exists, the results of our murderous activity south of the border. In Nicaragua, you take your skill as a poet not just into odd corners of society, but you take it into the seat of government. You become a poet president. You become a poet minister of interior. You become a poet's soldier. It's not considered shamanism or magic or weird. It's considered a necessary thing to do. It's considered useful. And here is my poem, It Is Time. Sandino wore a volcano for a sombrero. It was gold and so enormous it blocked out the sun. Rather, it was a second sun, a new one, a better one, because there's more to it. The old sun, you could see with it. It kept you warm and helped plants photosynthesize. The Sandino hat sun takes you in its arms, and at night, it doesn't leave you in the dark. You walk right inside the dome and turn the light off yourself if you're that kind of person who is tired and needs sleep and dreams. And I am, it is true. I climb in the hat and close my eyes.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Bob. Thank you for also sharing this precious, I'm going to call it document. Azul, I think it's a 2-hour movie, more.
An hour and a half, hour 40, something like that.
An hour 40, yes. An incredible, incredible film. I was also struck by, and this is going to bring me also to Ammiel's interview, which I'm going to share passages from with you. The sort of juxtaposition between the Sandinista movement and the way that they actually claimed institutional power as, you know, a poetic force, as opposed to perhaps what was happening in New York City, which was more like counterculture, anti-government, etc. Right, so they're like two different relationships to institutions and to power in that sense. And I think the interview that I'm going to read from is, I interviewed Ammiel in his Park Slope house, and he had prepared like mezes for me. It was very sweet. And he had all these posters on the wall, like Jimi Hendrix posters, and also Mahmoud Darwish poems, etc. And I think that the spirit of like the counterculture, bohemian kind of hippies that lived in the East Village, as it meets then a more kind of organized form of political organizing, is something that I think Ammiel sort of navigated himself, and that comes through in the interview with him. So I'm going to read some excerpts here. The interview I conducted with Ammiel was around an event called Poetry is News that he organized with Anne Waldman in 2003. And it was an event against the war in Iraq. and it filled the sanctuary, which is the biggest, the space adjacent to the parish hall, and it was extremely well attended. And I will read a little bit on the context of the event. So Ammiel says, so I ask him, what was the genesis of this event, and how did you and Anne come to collaborate, and what prompted the desire to do that? And this is Ammiel's response. Anne and I were and are still close, and Anne was always like, what are the poets doing? Why aren't they doing anything? My impulse was that people need to see other people who are just people. They might not have any particular expertise in one thing or another, but they bring whatever they're doing to the situation. That was really my point in bringing those kinds of people together. So there was Rachel McKean, for instance, who I met at an Europa summer workshop. She was teaching in a high school in Bushwick, and I'd been in touch with her. She said, I've got all these amazing kids who are resisting recruitment. I said, bring them on. That's exactly it. They were phenomenal. One of the highlights, really. These 17-year-old kids talking about how transparent the messaging was. Quote, you have no future, but sign up with the military. And they were like, wait a second, why do you want us if we have no future? And there was Rebecca Murray, who was a friend, who was with ISM and had been riding ambulances through Jenin. Ted Rall, a cartoonist who had been in Afghanistan. Paul Chan, a filmmaker who went to Baghdad. This is the same impulse that led Lost and Found, which Ammiel also edits, to publish a funny little pamphlet by Creeley called Context of Poetry, which he originally delivered as a talk. He spends the first 7 or 8 pages describing his process, the kind of paper he needs, the kind of space he had to be in. And then by the end, he reaches a point where he says none of this really matters because consciousness itself has changed. That's when he starts to get into what's actually happening. And then there's a Q&A afterwards with Philip Wallen and Ginsberg. It was at the Vancouver Poetry Conference, and somebody asks, what do you know about what's going on in Southeast Asia? This is in 1963. And Ginsberg says, I don't know, but I'm going because I want to see what's happening. So that was the impulse I was looking for. Why did Ted go to Afghanistan? He was a friggin' cartoonist. Why did Rebecca Murray join ISM? What led her to it? What are these high school kids just sitting there being fed this stuff, and how are they responding? We wanted to bring in a variety of people in different roles to let poets know that there's all kinds of things they can do. There's an incredible sense of disempowerment in these situations where people think, oh, I'm helpless, I can't do anything, poetry doesn't go anywhere. But that's bullshit. Because look, when Amiri Baraka wrote, somebody blew up America, it hit the front pages. That shows that if you write something powerful, people suddenly pay attention to poetry. It was the same at my reading with Musab Abu Toha. I said, I think people are here because we're going to say something. That was the impulse, really, I think. And I'm going to read also this last paragraph, which he asked me to read. And my question was, this is an obvious question, but you say you get how culture is important. How would you say that culture is important? And he answers, it's the basis upon which you both see and imagine things, how things are and what they could be. I mean, look, I've been steeped in matters related to Palestine for, let's say, 45 years. And everything I read keeps teaching me something new. I keep noticing things I wouldn't have seen before. I was reading Murid Baroudi, I saw Ramallah for a class I was teaching, which is really a masterpiece. And it almost begins and ends with reminiscences of Naji al-Ali, the revolutionary Palestinian artist whose daily comics were a constant thorn on the side of those in power. Naji al-Ali is a presence throughout the book, and Barghouti describes the memorial for Naji al-Ali after he was assassinated that I happened to be at in London. He describes the 3 young men who greeted everyone coming in, and I kind of remember them. I read this account, and I just got chills. And then kind of Ammiel sort of starts tearing up in real life, because I had been there myself. What I remember most was meeting Bulund al-Haidari, the great Iraqi poet, whom I knew was a friend of a good friend of mine in Jerusalem, Nassim Rejwan. They were friends in Baghdad in the late 40s. So I introduced myself, and Bulund said, "Don't go anywhere. When it's over, I want to sit down and write him a letter." It was just an unbelievable scene. Then I'm reading this other account of the same event, and I'm seeing these other worlds I'm familiar with, but only through this poetic projection. Barghouti's book is really extraordinary. He's constantly critical of himself, like when he does a poetry reading in the village he comes from, that scene where people are asking him to sign his book. He asks himself, if I had stayed here, would they have been asking me to sign this book? They don't know me, and I don't know them anymore. So he's constantly negotiating these kinds of questions. I feel that's what happens in culture. You're always negotiating memory, feeling, horizons, images, incidents, narratives. It keeps you alive to how the world is structured and projected, and to who you are, what you might allow yourself to do, be, or even think. That's fundamental. And I'm going to end Ammiel's contribution here.
When I got Miren's note to write something to respond to these interviews, I took it as a challenge, because I hadn't realized it's been 10 years almost since I started the New Rican Poets Cafe Founders Archive Project. It was like, wow, where did this time go? Because I'm one of the people who in 1974, when Miguel opened a cafe on East 6th Street, I was there. I had met Miguel. I met Patricia then too, Bob too. We all go back to those ancient times. And after reading the interviews, my first sensation was to think about occasion, and they're calling it the device. And that's such a loaded word, device. Device is a tool, and it's got to mean something. Who has invented this tool to use for what, to do what, and why? And the project back in those days, Patricia was part of the administration in 1984. What was I doing? In 1984, I was teaching we had closed a cafe for renovations, and they hadn't given us back the key yet. They gutted the inside of the building and took out the bathroom, so we couldn't work. So we just had to wait. When they finally gave it back, Bob came and Roland put up some money of their own so we could open the place and begin our work again in '89, right, Bob?
Exactly. Well, yep.
Wow.
They reopened Halloween '89.
Yes, and we're supposed to get it back again now.
It's
been
going to
closed.
reopen on Halloween, says La Bruja.
Yes.
Okay.
Kari is our director now, but the device, the words played in my head. occasion. What does that mean when you come out? You all have come out now for this occasion. Occasion has to do with memory, because we're here for some reason. Why you all come out? Because of the device is pulling you out? Because you've heard about what went on at the Poetry Project back in the day? Why you come? What you seeking to find out something? You seeking to discover? My head was spinning with all of those things. And then I started writing, and then Miran had put on a word limit on me.
5 minutes.
No, she didn't say that. She didn't say that. On the writing, 500 to 700 words. And I said, oh, Lord, well, it can be done. I did it. But sometimes a limitation is a good thing to force you to hone in on really, really what you're going to say here, what I'm going to say here now. And it did that for me. And then the other thing that it triggered in my head, this challenge, was place. Place is so important. I had the privilege and honor of being, 2 years ago, I was scholar in residence at the Schomburg Library. And I say a privilege to be there. You go downstairs, they give you your own little office and your own computer, and the only requirement is that you meet with Brent once a week for lunch. That's not so bad. But to have, and they cater it too, please. And we have a seminar together, all the scholar in residence. And I don't think of myself as a scholar, I just like to read. But I learned so much then about place. Place, and it comes, why am I saying all this? I'm saying all this because I have a sense the Poetry Project is coming to a point where you, like the cafe, has come to a point where I understand there is an aesthetic apart from the physical place. There's something here, you mentioned a minute ago, Bob, the New York School. Don't get me started, I have issues. We all have them. We all have issues, okay, with all those poets and people and whatnot, okay. We let that go. We let it go. But it comes to a point where I think, and this is part of why I started the archive project. For us to understand the grounding of the cafe is not all hinged to the place, to the building. And I think people here at the project are gonna be understanding that too. There has to be a certain aesthetic for it to perpetuate itself. We going on here. You come out tonight as the next generation, the next voices, the audience and the poets. One thing I have learned at the cafe is the space between audience and poet is really very narrow. It should be. Because if you can't talk back to me now, what good am I here if I am not prompting you to think something, to say something? What?
So what did you write?
Okay, we're getting there. Get off the soapbox, okay. Going on inside the place, the Poetry Project has a marathon reading sound man, and I think about Fisk,
John Fisk.
is recording the reports. Some of them will appear in The World. The World? The hubris, the pride, the world. So many spirit words get delivered to the place para servir como testigos, to testify about the fire. The fire. Outside the place, El Reverendo officiates. We know who he is. We huddle together in the cemetery behind St. Mark's Church, right here. We share the smoke from our breath. The night is cold, and El Reverendo is packing spirits. He spills spirits on the ground, an offering for the transition ones who've been at the fire over there and over here. Wind evaporates the spirits. The project publishes The World, and the world is narrow for connecting so many in the fire. But the world is big, and the world has been discontinued. And we have inner views about the fire that is over here and over there. With the smoke comes a strike of clarity. Who knew these days would come to see good and pretty succumb to fire? Now, this poem has 3 parts, but I'm not going to task your attention. I'm just going to leave it at that. To think that over here is over there. That's the point. That's the point of Nicaragua, of apartheid here, South Africa, and it's almost in Palestine and Gaza. Over there is over here. Do we not get it? That's all I say now. And to your Ruben Darío, you know, when I went to Guatemala, this was a few years after you went to Nicaragua, I met people, poets in the streets. I mean, people there at that point, had a different take on art and culture and what to do with it. Juventud. I mean, people reciting Neruda and Darío in the streets. Yeah. I mean, just you meet somebody in a cafe, Juventud, Divino Tesoro. Yes, you know, and just to quote it, and to think, come back here to go in my classroom to teach. What, Miss? I don't memorize things. You know, this has to change. A poet is a teacher too. A teacher is a poet too. I said enough. Okay.
Impossible acts to follow. Thank you.
No, you bring you.
I bring me. And I will say about me, you're not a scholar, but you like to read. I'm a scholar who would like to be more like a poet, and I also like to read. And part of what I like to read are these histories of here being elsewhere and elsewhere being here, which is what brought me to this text, this object that we have projected on the wall, which is a sort of forgotten archival object that just sort of flared up in my mind when I received this fantastic invitation to respond to this first issue of The Device and to be in conversation with you all. So years ago, while doing research on the sort of histories of cultural exchange between Palestine and Latin America, I was living in Jordan and I was sort of flipping through digital archives. I stumbled upon this page, right? This is the back cover of a February 1980, I have it here written here, yes, issue of the PFLP's English Language Bulletin, right? So the PFLP, the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, published an English language bulletin at the same time that it published its perhaps more well-known Arabic language journal, Al-Hadaf, for a number of years. And these are online. These are. I encourage you all to go peruse them, because they hold gems like this one, right? So I was sort of, kind of skimming this online archive, and I stumbled right on the back cover of this 1980 issue upon a familiar poem, Displaced. I don't want to say displaced or out of place. Let's say rehomed, reframed. The title is slightly off, right, and it's also been kind of muddled by the scanning, and the author, right, is not given, right. It says this is a section of a poem written by a Latin American patriot. But for those of you who know, and I'm sure many of you know, this is El Reverendo's Puerto Rican obituary.
Iglesia de Tomatos.
Pedro Pietri's perhaps magnum opus, Puerto Rican obituary, which begins, and I'll read those. One of you really should be reading, and if you know it by heart, maybe you'll read with me.
No, it's really long.
But it begins. They worked. They were always on time. They were never late. They never spoke back when they were insulted. They worked. They never took days off that were not on the calendar. They never went on strike without permission. They worked 10 days a week and were only paid for 5. They worked, they worked, they worked, and they died. They died broke. They died owing. They died never knowing what the front entrance of the First National City Bank looks like. Right. So this Puerto Rican obituary, which is, as I said, perhaps Pietri's, El Reverendo's most well-known poem, his magnum opus, this epic of thwarted Nuyorican dreams, which was first published in the Young Lord's newspaper Palante, and first performed in a church, right? One of El Reverendo's many churches. And the project was one of Pietri's churches. Miren just told me before we began that you looked at the archives, and he performed here 26 times, which is a lot of times. So this is what basically you could say, that the project was one of the cultural institutions that he helped build up, and helped orient towards not only anti-war organizing, but precisely toward and consciousness raising about the plight of Puerto Ricans and Nuyorican, but also, right, about Puerto Rico's colonial status and its connection, perhaps, to other, sites of oppression. Even if, as Bob said, right, and this is in the interview, which I encourage you to read, on this trip to Nicaragua, he almost caused an international scandal.
Oh, you're going to go there?
No. You went there. You went there. That's you did. You did go there. Yeah. And it sort of struck me, right, when I was remembering, which I won't spoil it, so that you have to read the issue. But it struck me, right, that to recall Pedro Pietri's presence, right, in this issue, right, of the PFLP, this bulletin dedicated, right, this issue is dedicated to the fight against American imperialism. In this moment, really does feel like this tremendous vindication of the claim that opens the device, Kay's claim, right, that the poetry belongs to what she calls, quoting Ruth Wilson Gilmore, an infrastructure of feeling through which people mapped their responsibilities to distant others, right, to that other place, to that elsewhere, and through which cultural work became inseparable from those responsibilities to that other place. And I wanted to draw attention as well, right, to this image that accompanies the poem on the back cover of the PFLP bulletin, which I find to be quite a striking drawing. You see this enormous hand embodying the United States that's reaching down and crushing a crowd, right? And across that crowd, another crowd is confronting it. You see these rifles emerging from the mass, but also pitchforks, seemingly, sickles, and perhaps also just kind of ordinary items, right, which are being weaponized in the heat of the struggle that is depicted here. And what this image seems to suggest to me, right, is that the adjacent text is also a weapon. What the image seems to do is, in fact, weaponize the poem next to it. The poem as a weapon was central to the poetics and visual language of anti-colonial and anti-imperial movements worldwide. And remembering Beatrice's appearance in the PFLP bulletin in the context of thinking with this issue, really made me want to reflect on the legacy of this figure, the figure of the poetry, the poem as weapon, right? Underpinning the thoughts of Ghazan Kanafani, for whom Silah al-Adab, the weapon of literature, extended beyond metaphor to become the cornerstone of his aesthetic theory, Roque Dalton, and many other militant poets or poet militants. The idea of literature as a weapon discomforted not only, we could say, the sort of mid-century advocates of art for art's sake, but also many Western leftist thinkers who were both kind of concerned about the proximity of poetry and weaponry, right, the sort of poet-soldier that populates Azul, but also concerned about the reduction of the poem to a status of a thing, right, the thing, a usable, purposeful object. The threat was, we could say, on freedom by way of inculcation or reification, or worse, the poem as a tool of inculcation turned into a kind of merchandise. So consider the weapon as a thing in this understandably ominous sense. Or, to quote Ruth Wilson Gilmore again, as she puts it, take a truncheon. For a cop to be paid to use a truncheon to bust your head open means the truncheon maker had a contract to produce truncheons, not luncheons, which means a whole series of political decisions about the allocation of material and symbolic resources has already steadied the cop's hand before she raised it. This vignette serves to illustrate what Gilmore calls the political economy of the truncheon, the deconstruction of which gives you some clues about where we can begin to make the world otherwise. The scene puts on display the layered infrastructures that not only produce the cop as an agent of state-sanctioned violence, for which she earns a wage, but also the industries and social imperatives that produce the truncheon as a commodity. A truncheon is an industrially made weapon for the production of servility. Minimal formal variation, maximal ideological effect. With the relationship between a weapon and a thing construed in this way, the idea of a literary weapon would seem to give credence to the foregoing fears, right? The sort of fears about the reduction of a poem to a thing. But consider as a counterpart to this mass-produced truncheon, the homemade bombs made by the Mau Mau rebels in Kenya, for instance, or the improvised contact bombs used by the Sandinista rebels. These makeshift weapons, crafted from readily available materials in contexts marked by great technological inequality, reflect a fundamentally different political economy than the truncheon abused by the capitalist cop. While the industrially produced truncheon represents a social form tied to the capitalist state and its role in maintaining property relations and class order, and is thus perhaps a dangerous thing for literature to aspire to be, the improvised rifles and the contact bombs show us how marginalized groups were led to creative efforts, right, to improvisation, producing things that we might in fact want to think of as aesthetically and functionally analogous to poetry. So it's not that a creative act is like a weapon, but that making a weapon can be a creative act embedded in and facilitated by infrastructures oriented towards liberation, towards the idea that making things is a humanizing activity that is available to all. And I'll end by quoting this wonderful line by Ammiel in the issue, which is inside, itself a quote, or perhaps various quotes. "Let there be thousands of poems, and let us not be scared to use them." Thank you.
Wonderful, wonderful. Thank you so much, Maru. Thank you so much, Lois, Patricia, Bob, for your sharing of memories of these particular events, and Lois and Maru for your beautiful responses to the issue. I prepared a bunch of questions, but it is 9:15, if I'm not mistaken, already. And I would like to follow Lois's prompt and invite you all to say something back. And Patricia also.
I just want to say something, just to kind of, one of the things that before all of these particular projects happened, when I was working at CCLM in the mid-'70s, I met a lot of people who were Sandinistas. And because they were poets and literary journalists, and we gave them money. And I remember, and just to kind of shift this a little bit, I remember when I was talking to one of them, the guy who was the editor of Tintan, and I asked him, because he was really, said, well, what kind of poems do you write? I mean, the guy was like going to the mountains to shoot people. I knew that. And he said, I write love poems. And I think we need to kind of keep that in mind when we're talking about these things. Like the reason why people get up and do really, why the ANC struggle continues, because of love as well as rage. And it's easier to see the rage. We sometimes forget the love.
Thank you, Patricia. And I also want to say, as also Kay wrote in her introduction, that these moments of political organizing or poetic organizing around political events are part of the past, but we're bringing them back because we think, people are obviously, and particularly now in this moment, still organizing, right? And we are in this room, culture workers, artists, writers, academics, activists, and there are new forms, right, also that are currently being shaped by all of us in terms of using culture as a weapon, right? How can we do that? I think this is a question for all of us to think about. Again, for the sake of time, I would really like to open it up to the audience, because I would love to hear from you. And please, just if you have a question, I hope you have questions, just like introduce yourself very briefly, and you can address your question to one of our guests, or it could be a question for all of them. Yeah, the floor is open. It doesn't have to be a question. It could be a response, impressions.
No, the scarf. Thank you. I'm freezing.
How about water?
Oh no, I'm fine. I'm just cold. It's freezing out here.
So the floor is open.
Preguntas.
Por favor.
Por favor.
Oh, there's one here. Yes. Okay.
Hello, can you hear me? Oh, okay. I guess this is a little selfish, but I've been thinking about my relationship with the English language. And so I didn't grow up here, moved here when I was 15, and sort of had to relearn a world of emotion and learn what it was like for other people sort of already be embedded in that world. And I was wondering for, our poets in the panel who write in multiple languages, some native, whatever you would take to mean that, or some not native, about sort of interacting with that, or using poetry as a vessel to build those bridges or those sites.
Use it! Over 180 languages are spoken in New York
800
City.
languages. You should read Language City by Ross Perlin. He'll tell you all about it. Yeah, we made at the Endangered Language Alliance a film called Kansai, which is a North Indian language that is in 50 different languages, 15-minute poem. So.
Use
yeah,
it.
Use it. That's exactly right. And no footnotes. You know, just put it in there. You know, that's it.
A question over there. Do you want to come also towards me?
Hi, my name is Leonora. I'm volunteering here, but Bob, your question made me think, or your speech made me think of, you were mentioning these avant-garde, early modernist poets that inspired so many Latin American revolutionaries and artists, and I was curious, why do you think there's such a draw to explicitly experimental poetry, and why is that important maybe for left politics?
Yeah, good one. You know, it's imagination, right? That's what the poem is. It's being able to put into the words what you don't have in the life, and then it becomes the life, right? So it's okay. You know, that's really what Darío opened up for Central America. It's a different color schema, right? And a different emotional construct, right? And so it's cool to watch the way that because you could see it in Leonel Rugama's poem, right? You know, that mix of you know, the romance and the surrealism of the Apollo, the political nature of the content, and also the proclamation, declamatory oral tradition that he's bringing to it. So all of that opened up, went back and forth. So now you find in most Central American countries that poetry is second only to baseball.
Maybe to continue on that thread, I just have a short comment also in response to what you're saying, Maru. You describe the poem as a weapon, and I think there's a long tradition, I think, in like leftist internationalist poetry to think of a poem as a weapon. But what I like about also what you said is that the utility of the poem is not opposed to the creative act. And just to build on the last question, right, you brought in the word experimental. I was thinking about, and Lois, you mentioned that, New York School poets, about like the tensions that exist or what they're perceived to be antithetical, right? The poem as a device to achieve a certain goal, and the poem as a form of expression in and of itself. And I think, and I like the fact that we don't have to think about them antithetically, that the device can be a creative act. So I think that's an interesting, just like a kind of good way of framing it, because there's been, you know, historically so much contention in these two ways of thinking about poetry. Yeah, and I think the Poetry Project is a good place to kind of not reconcile, because I think the antagonism is also interesting, but you know, think about these two traditions together. I think we have time for a silent room tonight. One more question, one or two more questions. If yeah, great.
Hello, my name is Cameron, a poet, publisher, whatever. I've been thinking a lot about with these poems and just like the prevalence of poetry in radical spaces today. I know a lot of people who did not give a shit about poetry posting Palestinian poems on their Instagram recently, or I think about the Zapatista movement, another poet-led movement in southern Mexico. So I just want to ask about the role of translation for people in English-speaking countries, and how that can be important in these movements. Do
it, yes.
Okay.
I think the issue is that if you say it's an issue, then you're going to have to take care of it.
But I'll say perhaps.
Here, say it in there.
I'll say, basically, I speak so loudly. You know, one thing that I think has been really, as someone who spends a bit of time thinking about Palestinian poetry, one thing that's been really remarkable about infrastructurally about our present is that collective translation as a practice is becoming increasingly prevalent. And I think you'll notice, if you're also paying attention to contemporary Palestinian poetry, especially poetry from Gaza, the number of books that are being translated by groups of people, right, with various degrees of fluency in the language, who are bringing different skills and different types of attention to that production. And I think that that is something to further and something to organize around, because I think that it both responds to the urgency, but also takes it very seriously, as again, it's an intellectual practice to be working together, right, and not be putting these sort of barriers in terms of, oh, this is an individual exercise where you have to have this degree of superior fluency in order to do this task, right? These are ultimately impediments. So that would be one, I don't know where you are, one of my answers to that question.
That's well said. You know, you'll have, you know, there's Archipelago books, and there's Ugly Duckling, and there's the World Press that Matfei just started. So we're seeing a lot of this happening. But this idea of translating from where you are in the language, you know, I wanted to bring tonight, I have this big book from Nicaragua, Mayakovsky's poem, Lenin, translated into Spanish. I don't know if it's ever been translated into English, but the Russians translated it into Spanish and brought it to Nicaragua as their gift. Yeah.
And one thing, too, about translation, you discover when you translate something, you become the poet. You enter the language because you have to bring it from one place to another, and you are the poet then.
Like I said, you have to take up the issue.
Okay, unless there's another burning question, I think we can end here. I want to thank our guests so much tonight, Maru, Bob, Lois, Patricia. Thank you so much for your contributions. I also want to thank the Poetry Project staff and techs working tonight, Nora and Pedro, for handling the mic situation so gracefully. Gary, Bicho, who's photographing, Heather, of course, Nicole and Anna, and our volunteers working tonight. Thank you so much. Thank you for coming, and please come back to the Poetry Project.
I have these photos of Nicaragua, including El Reverendo right here, from there. So
I want to take a photo of that photo.